This is going to close out our Sunday evening sessions that are coordinated with the Bible Bowl. You'll want to be turning to Acts chapter 12, and then we'll start some other things. I'm thinking I've got a book at home on Christian virtues, and I'm thinking I'm going to start maybe working through some of the lessons on that book and turning them into the Bible lessons, character building type sermons on Sunday night. So I'm thinking I'm going to go there. Not for sure yet, but let's get to Acts chapter 12 and see this interesting piece of the Bible here. Now there's something here that I found very interesting. There are the New Testament writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Peter, Paul, James, and Jude. Maybe you could just memorize that and roll that out. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Peter, Paul, James, and Jude. And I put anonymous on there for Hebrews because we don't really have, it may have been one of those other ones that we mentioned. But these are the number of books that they wrote. Luke wrote 2. That'd be Luke and Acts. Actually, those 2 are more than any other writer has written. Any other single, even more than all of Paul's 13 epistles, because they're such long books. So I think that's kind of interesting. But total of 27 books in the New Testament. In the story we're going to tell tonight, we've got this many of those writers represented. Mark, Luke, that wrote this, John, Peter, Paul, and James, all in the same story. And maybe Judas and possibly Matthew was part of this as well. I'll show you where Jude may have been a part of this. As I should say Jude instead of Judas, though that was what he's called. Where Jude may have been a part of this, and we'll see. It could be we have all of the writers of the New Testament involved in the same story here. But at least we know that we've got 6 of the 8. And that represents 24 of the 27 books. So it's just interesting that they were all together. We'll start next chapter 11. And in these days came prophets from Jerusalem unto Antioch. And there stood up one of them named Agabus, and signified by the Spirit that there should be a great dearth throughout all the world, which came to pass in the days of Claudius Caesar. Remember that. We'll get to that in a moment. Then the disciples, every man according to his ability, determined to send relief unto the brethren which dwelt in Judea, which also they did. They sent it to the elders. First time we read about elders in the church. Send it to the elders at the hands of Barnabas and Saul. So Paul is in that list of the 13 epistles, but he's called Saul here instead of Paul. Now, the days of Claudius Caesar. The 12 Caesars. These are the classical 12 Caesars. Well, what about Julius Caesar? Well, sometimes he's counted as a Caesar, and sometimes he is not. You know, he was assassinated as he was being crowned. They put the crown on his head and then assassinated him right then, all together. They didn't impeach people then. They just assassinated them, okay? So it was pretty rough. And that was, some of the senators wanted him crowned and some of them wanted assassinated. So the assassins went forward when they crowned him and stabbed him to death. Pretty rough government, wasn't it? But then after that came Augustus. And I've got the dates at which they were a Caesar. Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius. Now it came into pass in the days of Claudius Caesar. He was Caesar from 41 to 54. And that starts putting us then some timelines. We're going to narrow it down a little closer than that. And then Nero, Galba, Otho, Vertillus, Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian. And some think that the book of Revelation was written while Domitian was Caesar. So the 12 Caesars the 12 classical Caesars fall right into that period of the New Testament. But I'm not going to go too far into that this time. But we read about Herod the king. Acts 12. Now about this time Herod the king stretched forth his hand to vex certain of the church. Well, there's a lot of Herods, and 10 of them are found in the New Testament. Here's a few of them. I think, is this 5? 5 of the 10 Herods. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 of the Herods. 6 of the New Testament Herod. Well, Aristobulus is not named in the New Testament. I got the date of their death here, and you'll see why that's significant in a moment. But look, Herod the Great, the one that slaughtered the innocents, they say he died at 4 BC. How could that be? Well, they think that was because there was a mistake in setting the dates early on, and Jesus then would have been born about 6 to 4 BC instead of 1 AD, as the old calendar used to say. And then Herod the Great had several sons. He was afraid Aristobulus was going to try to take his throne. And so he killed him. That's why Aristobulus was put to death at 7 BC, and Herod lived on to 4 BC. You know, if Herod would kill his own son, if he thought that was a risk to his throne, little wonder he would have slaughtered the innocents at Bethlehem. He kind of turned into a madman toward the end of his reign. But he had a son named Agrippa. He's called Agrippa the First. And then there's an Agrippa the Second. That's the one we were talking about this morning, that Paul said, "Believest thou the prophets? I know that thou believest." That's Agrippa the Second. The son of this Agrippa that in this chapter is called Herod the King. Note when he died, AD 44, early in that year. And so this is going to date Acts chapter 12, and it's one of those places where we can coordinate the time of biblical events with the time of historical events that we know about. I'll show you as we go. Now about that time, Herod the king stretched forth his hand to vex certain of the church. And he killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. Now there's James and John. James, the older brother. Remember they were out fishing? Jesus called James and John to him. Peter, James, and John, kind of that inner circle with Christ. And their mother came to Jesus and said, "Would that my sons would sit on the right hand and on thy left." And Jesus says, "Woman, you don't know what you ask. Are they able to drink the cup that I drink and be baptized with the baptism that I'm to be baptized with?" They said, "We're able." They didn't know what they were asking for. James, the first of the apostles to be put to death. John was the last of the 12 to die. And it seemed like he may have died a natural death. Maybe upwards of about 100 years old when John died. The right hand and the left. They didn't know what they were asking. Well, Herod, because he saw it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to take Peter also. And then were the days of unleavened bread. That is the Passover week. The days of unleavened bread. It would end with the Passover occurring. And so this would be then in that springtime of the year. And that tells us maybe Peter locked up maybe for a week, arrested him, and then, well, you can't put him to death this week. It's the Passover week. And they didn't want to fool with that during the Passover week. So as soon as Passover week's over, we'll take care of Peter. And when they had apprehended him, he put him in prison, delivered unto him 4 quaternions, and I'm not sure how to say that, of soldiers to keep him, intending him after Easter to bring him forth to the people. Okay, class, this morning, I was wrong. I didn't do my math right, okay? 4 quaternions, 4 times 4 is 16. I think I said 12 soldiers guarding him. 16 soldiers, if it comes up on the test, okay? 16 soldiers. They'd take their time, about 3 hours apiece, through the night, guarding him. And when he had apprehended him, put him in the prison, delivered him to 4 quaternions of soldiers to keep him, intending after Easter to bring him forth to the people. Easter What's Easter doing here? There was no day of Easter. Every other translation you'll consult probably has Passover there instead of Easter. Well, why would the King James translators put Easter here? The old translators were, most of the time, very careful to try to give you what the text says without trying to interpret the text. Now, that makes the Bible hard to just see what it says. It's easier to read if the translators will bring the Bible closer to you and try to explain it as they translate it. And they call that dynamic equivalence. A lot of people criticize the King James Version here because it says Easter, and they're trying to defend this modern versions. I say, well, they were ahead of their time. They did a dynamic equivalent before you even thought about it. That's what Easter is. It'd be like a dynamic equivalent. Why would they put Easter? They're translating a Bible for the English people, and they wouldn't know what time the Passover was, but it falls right on top of what the Western Easter was. So they put Easter there, but that's not what the word is. The word is the Passover. It's not telling us to observe Easter. It's simply marking the time of the year that was there. But the word Passover is usually translated, and that's the correct translation for this, instead of Easter. Now, let's look at verse 5. Peter, therefore, was kept in prison. Here's important. Prayer was made without ceasing of the church and to God for him. This is a great chapter on prayer. And when Herod would have brought him forth the same night. Now this is right after the Passover. That same night. I guess that would have been a Saturday evening and Saturday night, because that would end the Passover week, and the next day, the first day of the week. So that same night, Peter was sleeping between two soldiers, bound with two chains, and the keepers before the door of the prison. And behold, the angel of the Lord came upon him, and the light shined in the prison, smote Peter on the side, and raised him up, saying, "Arise up quickly." And the chains fell off his hands. And the angel said, "Gird thyself and bind up thy sandals." And he did so. And he said to him, "Cast thy garment about thee and follow me." Peter, to be executed the next day, was getting a good night's sleep. That tells you something about Peter. I think it was Watson. Can't think of his first name. A preacher, Watson, one of the Puritan preachers, said a man with faith can sleep in the mouth of a cannon. And that seems to be what Peter was doing that night. Well, he went out and followed him, and wist not that it was true. That is, he knew not it was true which was done by the angel, but thought he saw a vision. You remember Paul? Caught up into the third heaven. He said, whether into the body or out of the body, I cannot tell. God knoweth. Paul thought that might have been real. It was so real. If it was a vision, it sure did seem real. And that's what this was with Peter. This is real, and he's thinking it sure seems like a vision. Well, they passed the first and the second ward, and then came to the iron gate leading into the city. And I heard this afternoon that was a massive gate of solid iron, heavy, massive gate. And look what happened. It opened to them of its own accord. Its own accord is the Greek word automatos. That's when we get automatic. It just automatically opened that big iron door. And they went out and passed through on one street, and forthwith the angel departed from him. And when Peter was come to himself, he said, "Now I know with surety that the Lord hath sent his angel, and hath delivered me out of the hand of Herod, and from all the expectation of the people of the Jews." And when he'd considered the thing, he came to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose surname was Mark, where many were gathered together praying. This is the mark that would later accompany Paul and Barnabas on that first missionary journey, and would later write the book of Mark that we've been preaching from on Sunday mornings. He knew these people. He was acquainted with them. So, they were gathered there praying. Peter knocked at the door, the gate, and a damsel came to hearken named Rhoda. Okay? Rhoda, I expect she was a teenager, don't you? Watch what she does. And when she knew Peter's voice, she opened not the gate for gladness, but ran in and told how Peter stood before the gate. And they said to her, thou art mad. But she constantly affirmed that even it was so. Then they said, it is his angel. His angel. There are people that think when we die, we turn into angels. They say, well, we die. And there are even some that say if you've got to do a good deed after you're dead, and then your angel gets your wings. Isn't that what It's a Wonderful Life is about? The angel gets their wings, you know. That's not this kind of angel. There's a verse in the Bible that a lot of speculation about this, where it talks about the little children, behold, their angels do behold the heavenly face of their Father. And they say, well, that's guardian angels. Well, did you notice that those angels are not beholding the children, but they're beholding the face of the Father? They're not watching the children. What are we talking about? These angels. Every now and then, I've come to the conclusion, every now and then the word angel is used for the Spirit. It's not talking about that order of angels that God has that are ministering spirits for us, but referring to our spirit as our angel. The little children, suffer the little children to come into me. Listen, in their spirit, they just want to look to God and see what God wants them to do. They want to be good children. That's what that means. So when it says his angel, it's his angel. They're probably meaning by that it's his spirit that is out there, thinking that Peter had suffered the same fate as James. Well, Peter continued knocking. And when they opened the door and saw him, they were astonished. Isn't that what they'd been praying for? You know, we talk about the prayer of faith, and I don't doubt they had faith that God was hearing their prayer and God would do what was best, but it doesn't look like they expected the prayer to be answered the way they thought it was. And they were astonished. God's power is greater than our faith in prayer, isn't it? And so, he beckoned to them with the hand to hold their peace. And then, no, I got to explain this. And it says, he declared to them how the Lord brought him out of the prison. And he said, go show these things unto James and to the brethren. And he departed and went into another place. This is not the James that was beheaded in the first of this chapter. There's another James. We read about a James that's very prominent among the elders and the apostles in Jerusalem, and it's James, the Lord's brother. He did not believe earlier, but after Jesus rose from the dead, he is with them in that upper room, and he believes. And he became very prominent in the church at Jerusalem. This is the James that wrote the book of James in our Bible. And it says James and his brethren. Now, that could just be other Christian brothers. It could be the other brothers of the Lord. That may be where Jude works into this a little bit right here, too. Because Jude is a brother of James, who's a brother of the Lord. So Jude was a brother of the Lord, too. So go tell James and the brethren, and he departed and went into another place. Now, Peter's going to disappear from the book of Acts. He'll show up a little bit more, but the story's going to turn from Peter now. Peter probably left Jerusalem and went somewhere else because of the danger to his life, and that may have been where Peter began his missionary journeys that carried him, we know, to Corinth, and Galatia and Pontus and Cappadocia, and those brethren he wrote in his epistles. And when Herod sought for him and found him not, he examined the keepers. You know, they would examine by scourging, wouldn't they? I wonder what those keepers went through. He commanded that they should be put to death. That was the penalty for letting a prisoner escape. And he went down from Judea to Caesarea and there abode. Caesarea is where the Romans ruled Judea from, not Jerusalem. So he returned to that city by the sea where that port was and stayed there. Now, Herod was highly displeased with them of Tyre and Sidon. That's on further north. But they came with one accord to him, having made Blastus, the king's chamberlain, their friend, desired peace, because their country was nourished by the king's country. Here's looking at these cities. Jerusalem, that's the arrow down toward the bottom. Caesarea, that's the one over by the sea. Up north there are Tyre and Sidon. You see the little crook up there on the coastline? That's about where Mount Carmel is. And the Jezreel Valley empties out into the sea at that point. And the Jezreel Valley, Lori and I saw that when we were over there. It is a very fertile, highly productive agricultural area, even to this day. And you get up around Tyre and Sidon, and they didn't have a lot of coast, for they were in the hills. They needed the food coming up out of that Jezreel Valley. And I wonder if the urgency had to do with this dearth that the prophet had been talking about. They wanted to make friends with Herod fast. So, it says, on a set day, Herod, arrayed in royal apparel, sat on his throne and made an oration to them. It's probably in Caesarea by the sea. We went to an amphitheater there, and the sun would have risen from behind the amphitheater, rising from the east and shining with Herod with his back to the west. If that's where he was on his throne. There's another place it could have been there. It's hard to tell. Josephus tells us that this royal apparel was made of silver. I saw a little girl coming out of, when we were coming out of Fazoli's this afternoon. She had a pretty little dress on. And the whole top of it was these sparkly little things, you know. When I saw it sparkling, I thought of that coat made of silver, with the sun shining on that, and you've seen the sun reflect off a mirror or maybe off a window, and it can almost be blinding, can't it? And so here it is, these sparkles going out all over that arena with that sun shining on him. And I tell you, these Herods, it's like they thought they were gods and worthy of worship. So the people gave a shout saying, "It is the voice of a God and not of a man." And immediately the angel of the Lord smote him, because he gave not God the glory, and he was eaten of worms and gave up the ghost. Josephus tells this, and he doesn't tell it exactly like this, but it fits. He was making his oration, and suddenly he had a terrible pain in his stomach, in his abdomen. And they took him out and laid him on a bed, and for 5 days he lingered while he was being eaten from the inside out of worms, maggots that had got into sores that had spread into his body, and he laid for 5 days in a horrible state, being eaten of worms. I tell you what, every now and then I see these preachers that really love to get out in front of people and receive the praise while they're preaching. You've seen that, hadn't you? Like one fella said, it's like they love the smell of their own perfume. And they love the attention and the praise. And when I see a preacher strutting around like that and feeling proud of that, I just think, maybe somebody ought to check him for worms. Because we're just men, aren't we? Well, he was eaten of worms. And the way it describes his death, he gave up the ghost. He's dead. But the word that he was against. The Word of God grew and multiplied. It wasn't dead. It's the living oracles that continued on after the death of this king. Barnabas and Saul, there's Paul, 13th epistle Paul. Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they'd fulfilled their ministry and took with them John, whose surname was Mark. What an interesting story. The power of prayer. The power of prayer is in this story. Praying without ceasing. Gathering together with the church to pray. Mary opened her house for the church to come have a prayer meeting. And when the sun rose on the first day of the week that morning, they're having that prayer meeting. And Peter shows up. Isn't that a beautiful story? Let's not forget the power of prayer and the power of the gospel. Let it grow. Let it multiply. And it does that as it enters into the hearts of men. And they receive it. And they're baptized into Christ. We need to let it grow tonight. Come forward while we stand and sing.